Well, hello and greetings, International Studies 200 students. Welcome back. This week we'll be continuing on our section on culture and cultural globalization. We have a couple of poems and a couple of other readings. And so, what I wanted to do today is just talk a little bit about what we've discussed so far in terms of culture and cultural globalization, how that relates to the two poems that we're reading this week, and how we can use our critical lenses to analyze those poems and why they're very important to the study of globalizations, and why poems and literature like them are very important to the study of globalization, particularly cultural globalization. So, just a quick review. Last week we talked about culture. You read the McCormick PDF, and you had a lecture by me where I went over definitions of culture and ended with a fairly complex discussion of anthropological definitions of culture. We went over Clifford Geertz and the definition that he uses in his book, Interpretation of Culture. And so I just wanted to review really quick about how we can define culture and cultural globalization. And so we left off last week defining culture roughly as the customs, the arts, which include music, film, literature. It's also the expressions, social institutions, social norms, way of being, values. It's the webs or structures of meaning or significance people have, and the achievements of a particular nation, of a particular community, people, or other social group. So that's culture in general. And when we pair it with globalization, the subject of this class, right, and we think back to our initial definitions of culture, particularly the Sheila Croucher article about the interconnection of all of these global processes, phenomena, practices, ideas, then we can define cultural globalization as the global interconnectedness, the global relevance of all of the aspects of culture that we covered in just this definition that I just gave you, and everything that we talked about last week, and that is in the readings for last week as well. So it's that global relevance and global interconnection of everything that's underneath or within that broad umbrella of culture as we've been talking about it. So we can start to think about cultural globalization, and if you want more resources on that, you can actually go back to our textbook chapter on cultural globalization to get a little bit more about that. They have a good chapter in that as well. And we'll discuss that further online and or in our live discussion on Thursday. But what I wanted to do is talk a bit about the two poems that I assigned for this week and that we'll be reading and we'll be analyzing. And what they represent really for us are artifacts of cultural globalization. So as we know, poetry itself, literature itself, art, it falls under the umbrella of culture because it comes out of groups of human societies, human cultures, human social groups. And it also tells us something about those cultures, those social groups. So literature, film, art, it's the expression of culture, right? We could say that. But it also gives us a way to analyze culture itself. So what does it say about the humans that produce it in particular contexts? So these poems have a global relevance. And we'll get into why that is or how that is. But as you read them, you'll find that they speak to not just a particular localized region and not just a particular nation state, but have a transnational or global relevance. And so that is why we can look at them as objects of cultural globalization to study, or artifacts of cultural globalization to study. But also further than that, they're works that actually have arguments themselves. They're works that actually have philosophies within them, have values within them, and so we can actually use them to help us understand globalization itself. And that will be evidenced in our discussion of and your analysis of these poems. So I really want you to take a sort of critical view of these poems, critical in the sense of analytical. I want you to dissect them. I want you to ask questions about why the authors are making the choices that they make. What are they talking about? What are the themes in these poems? So I want you to spend a lot of time with these poems, and I want you to think back to the first week, and if you need to go back and revisit this module, but the first module where we talk about critical reading, I want you to use all of those tools to analyze these poems. So they're short. We don't have long readings this week, but that doesn't mean we can skim them over and move on, and that we can celebrate having understood them. We can't. We have to put in at least as much work as we would a dense chapter in reading a small poem, or else we won't get anything out of it and it won't tell us anything, because there's a lot there. So I wanted to use this opportunity here to just give a sort of brief primer on how we might do that. The first thing I'm going to do, and we're going to venture, so we're interdisciplinary, right? You remember in international and global studies, that means we draw off all sorts of different disciplines to help us attain the goals that we set, how to kind of figure out what globalization is. So we used anthropology last week. This week we're going to use literary studies. So I wanted to start out with what you could call analysis not just of poems and literature, but the study of language itself, specifically figures of speech. What is a figure of speech? It includes things like metaphors, similes, all those things that you learned in your high school composition class, rhetorical techniques, all sorts of things that pepper our language, whether you're conscious of it or not. One example that I mentioned last week is the metaphor that Clifford Geertz uses to define culture. And figures of speech, like a metaphor, for example, which is the comparison of two unlike objects in a particular way, are fundamentally valuable because they're not there just for fun. They're not there just to be sort of creative. They're also there to make a point in a way that is more incisive or concise, or a point that is some way better than perhaps a literal expression. So a literal expression, you know what the difference between literal and figurative is, right? Figurative has to do with metaphor. For example, it's so hot out, I'm melting. That's a figure of speech because it's not literal. I'm not literally melting, right? So we're going back to kind of this stuff that I think we already know, the difference between figurative and literal. Metaphor being a figure of speech. The Clifford Geertz metaphor is that humans are animals suspended in webs of significance, webs of meaning that they themselves have created. So the metaphor is that culture is a web. Culture is a web. If it was a simile, it would be like culture is like a web, right? And we talked about what that is and why that's important last week. So we can go back to my discussion of why he uses the web example for his metaphor to define his argument about culture. It's an incisive use of a figure of speech, a metaphor, to make a point about something, right? To help us understand something in a better way than we could if he had just been literal. If we just stick to the sort of dry definition of culture, maybe we wouldn't quite have that picture that Geertz wants us to have of culture. And so it's important to kind of understand the techniques that are used, not just in language, but in our case, literature here, specifically poems, because they give us a better way of understanding something. They give us even arguments that exist within the text, the arguments that the text are making. And maybe they are able to do that in a way that defamiliarizes us a little bit. Maybe this comparison of two unlike things actually gets us out of a sort of habituated, traditional or conventional way of thinking about something to make us think about something anew, right? And so that's the point of figure of speech, and that's the point of literature in this respect. So I wanted to talk about two figures of speech or literary devices, things that these authors are doing with language in the two poems that we're reading for this week. And so we have two awesome poems from two awesome writers. The first is a poet, writer, performer named Shailja Patel. She wrote a book called Migritude in 2010, and it actually came out of a spoken word kind of performance piece from 2006. It's really awesome. Check it out. If you Google it, you can find out about it. I actually have a bunch of publications on it, not a bunch, but a couple, and you can look at that if you want sort of more on her and more examples of analyses of her work. But she is a South Asian Kenyan who lived in Great Britain for a while, also lived in the United States for a while, so she's very transnational. And what a South Asian Kenyan means is that it's someone of Indian heritage from India, but who is born and raised in the diaspora in Kenya, which is in East Africa, right? So she's South Asian Kenyan, but was educated and spent much of her life in Britain and then later the United States. She's actually back in Africa now, so she's just simply a world citizen, you could say, or a global traveler. So just the biography is global. Just the biography will make us think about globalization and how that makes her biography possible, but her words themselves also give us a sense of how it gives us a good perspective or different perspective on globalization. In her poem, Shilling Love, part 1 that we read today, which is about love, it's about family, it's about migration, and also, interestingly, it's about economics. And that's something I want to discuss with you, and I want you to think about very carefully. We also have a Somali Kenyan British poet named Warsan Shire. So she's of Somali heritage, so that's Somalia is in the Horn of Africa. Somali heritage, i.e. her parents are Somali, born and raised in Kenya, and lives in Britain, educated and spent time in Britain. So she's also a sort of diasporic global citizen, like Patel, if you will. And I wanted to start, and so she has this poem, Home, that we are reading, and it's about refugee crises. It's about what it's like to be a refugee and what home means in this context. And so I want you to study both of these poems very carefully, and I want you to come with questions and comments, again, whether in our live discussion or our online discussion that we'll have. But I wanted to focus just on two sort of literary devices that they use, and just a couple of words here, because you can do a lot with just a line of poetry. And I wanted to start out with two lines from Home by Warsan Shire, the first two lines, and she starts with a metaphor. She starts with a figure of speech. The speaker of the poem states, and the speaker of a poem is essentially like the narrator of a novel. So we can't confuse the author themselves with either the narrator of the novel that they write or the speaker of the poem that they write. So the speaker of the poem writes or states, whatever you will. No one leaves home unless home is the mouth of a shark. So no one leaves home unless home is the mouth of a shark. So this has a lot of relevance in terms of refugee contexts, most immediately, But if you look at the sort of literary angle and what she's doing there, she is using a metaphor. So the metaphor, again, remember, is comparing two unlike things, using the word is. And the metaphor here is that home is the mouth of a shark. And one way to kind of figure out what's going on in these metaphors is to actually look at the characteristics of the thing that it's being compared to. So home, what are the characteristics of home, right? We think of it not just as our house or a building, but a space that includes family, friends, the domestic sphere. Home is something with, or usually or can have positive connotations. There's all sorts of ways you can think about home. Homeland, where I'm from, a particular region. Again, family, and it can be connoted with love, as in the Patel poem, Family and Love. So there's all sorts of things that we can think about when we think about the object of home or the thing of home. And this is compared in the metaphor that Shire writes or constructs with the mouth of a shark. So when we think about the mouth of the shark, we usually don't have positive connotations. It's usually something, we usually connote it with things like danger. Maybe we think about the movie Jaws. Jaws is a horror film, right? It's not a romance or a rom-com or a comedy or an action. It's sort of action-packed, but we think of the mouth of a shark. You've got sharp teeth, blood, predator, all that stuff. So you have this image that you can think of, the mouth of a shark, sort of jumping out of the ocean with sharp teeth. Maybe you've watched Shark Week or something like that, where you see the big shark jumping out and eating the seal. So you have a whole different set of connotations and meanings than you do home. And what she's saying in this particular passage is that home is the mouth of a shark, or no one leaves home unless home is the mouth of a shark. So not all homes are mouths of sharks, right? But some homes. And which home is the mouth of the shark for those who have to leave, right? And in this context, the subject of the poem or the theme of the poem is being a refugee. If I'm a refugee, why am I leaving? But it's also about conceptions, outsider conceptions of what a refugee is. So in the global north, in the United States, Europe, England, and all sorts of places, there's all sorts of different discourses going around about what an immigrant is, what a refugee is. In some circles, they are portrayed as scary, as invaders, as criminal, as all sorts of things, all sorts of demonization and dehumanization of the people, right, who are refugee. And so what Warsan and Shire are doing here with this metaphor, no one leaves home unless home is the mouth of the shark, is to say that we have to think about the reasons behind why people are forced to leave. And a refugee is somebody who's forced to leave somewhere for fear of persecution in whatever way, right? So the difference between a refugee and an immigrant is that an immigrant is someone who chooses to leave for whatever reason, and a refugee is somebody who's forced to leave. And so if we think about the point here, it really gives us a picture of the refugee experience, and it sort of humanizes refugees. And she does that by using figure of speech like metaphors, like this one here, home is the mouth of the shark. So I want to further this discussion with you, and I want you to critically analyze this and see what she's doing, and I want you to pick your own figure of speech here, whether it's a metaphor, simile, or anything else she's doing in this poem, and I want you to analyze it just like we've just done here with this short critical reading of the line, home is the mouth of a shark. I wanted to move on to one line that's actually repeated in a little bit different ways in Shailja Patel's poem, Shilling Love. And I've got the whole book here. I would highly recommend it if you're interested in it. Shailja Patel, Migratude. It's super great and super awesome. We're reading just a couple of pages of a poem, one poem called Shilling Love Part 1. And another rhetorical strategy or literary device that are particularly meaningful is the repetition of a word or the repetition of a line, and that's called a refrain. So you have a couple of lines, then you have one line, a couple more, it's repeated, and then more, and it's repeated throughout. The repetition of these things can create a theme, and they can do all sorts of things. A theme is like a main idea that an author is trying to put forth, or kind of like the main topic or the main kind of argument of a particular piece, whether it's a poem or a novel. And you get there by repeating certain things, whether you're repeating an object, a word, repeating an idea, repeating a statement, anything like that. If it's repeated deliberately and there's meaning behind that repetition, it can create a theme. And so I wanted to focus on, as I mentioned, Shailja Patel's poem here, it's about home also. It's about leaving home. It's about family. It's about love. It's about the domestic sphere. It's about the relationship between parents and children. It's about migration. But it's also about economics. And I wanted to hone in on this economic angle because it is solidified in this refrain that she uses. And it's about devaluation. So the first time this theme is the theme and or refrain is stated is on the bottom of the first page. 1975, 15 Kenyan shillings to the British pound. So this is about devaluation, and devaluation is the deliberate downward adjustment of the value of a country's money relative to another currency or another country's money. So the US dollar to the Mexican peso, or in this case, the pound, the British pound, to the Kenyan shilling. The first thing you have to do is think about historical context. The historical context is that there's a colonial relationship between Britain and Kenya, in the sense that Britain had colonized Kenya until the 1960s. And so that's the first thing we should think about, because we're putting those two currencies, but they're not random. There's a colonial relationship between the two, between the British pound and the Kenyan shilling, and it's about devaluation, which is the deliberate diminishing of the value of one country's currency in relation to another country's currency. And so on the face of it, ostensibly, devaluing a currency reduces the country's exports, or reduces the cost of a country's exports, and can ostensibly help shrink trade deficits. So the idea behind devaluation is that it reduces the cost of a country's exports, the products that it's exporting, to help shrink a trade deficit. And a trade deficit occurs when a country's imports exceed its exports. So when it's importing more things that it's exporting, which can create all sorts of problems. So we also need to look at historical and contemporary contexts, and we need to know that colonialism historically and globalization have produced overdependence in the global south on imports, and that creates trade deficits, right? So the over-reliance on imports, while neoliberalism, one of its mainstays in terms of structural adjustment programs that we talked about, is devaluation. And this increases prices for people and therefore decreases the purchasing power of citizens to buy the things they need, food, rent, medicine, whatever, right? So it destabilizes economy. And you can think of the reasons behind devaluation, we kind of think about it in relationship to power structures, i.e. global north and global south. It's beneficial for giant rich countries in the global north and multinational corporations because it creates cheap, they can get the cheap exports from a particular country, and then they can sell their imports to that country because it becomes dependent on this for more, right? So it's good for one side, it's not good for the other, generally speaking, or can be. Um, and there's all sorts of evidence that devaluation in this particular sense um, has not enriched the global South in the ways that we just talked about. So that's just a really quick and rough and limited discussion of devaluation. But that is what Shailja Patel chooses to use as a refrain in her poem, right? We might not expect global economics to come into play in a poem. Well, guess what they do? And that's exactly what tells us about globalization. But not just in the sense of a definition, like the boring one I just gave you. She actually gives it to you in the middle of a poem about family, love, migration, destabilization, and the relationship, the sort of fears of migration, the fears of parents, and all of that stuff. So it makes us ask the question: is why does she do that? So the refrain again, after stanzas on domestic life, love, and migration, are, for example, 15 Kenyan shillings to the British pound, and then a few stanzas later, which is like a paragraph of a poem, 1977, 20 Kenyan shillings to the British pound, more stanzas, the shilling falls against the pound. So it actually creates this... It creates a sort of speed, because the shilling is just falling and falling and falling and falling, and so the tension is rising and rising and rising and rising, and you get a sense of some action that is happening. You get a sense of something bad is going to happen. The shilling continues to fall, and that refrain is really effective in the sense that it gives that reader a sense of speed, a sense of action, a sense of tension. Why is it there? Well, it has something to do with globalization and colonialism. And why is she breaking up language? And why is she breaking up a poem about migration, love, and family by inserting these refrains that have to do with the falling shilling against the British pound? We know that devaluation creates crisis. We know that it creates continuing destabilization and destabilization. So you have things kind of spiraling downwards, just like the shilling is spiraling downwards against the British pound, at the same time that destabilization, purchasing power destabilization and diminishing purchasing power is going up and up and up. And that has something to do with migration. We talked about the difference between an immigrant and a refugee. So what does that mean here? Is this falling shilling having something to do with rising out migration? Falling shilling, rising out migration. Falling shilling, more destabilization, more out migration. What is she doing with these refrains here? So what I want you to do is answer that question with your own critical reading of this poem. And I want you to answer the question of why both of these poems are relevant globally, whether economically, whether politically, whether culturally, to the study of globalization. And so I want you to bring comments and questions to our discussions, whether online or live. And I want you to tell me, through your critical reading of these poems, given everything we know now, why they are rich, why they are so important, what is incisive about them, what interested you, what you're confused about, and we will continue the discussion, again, either online or live. I hope to see those of you that are in Section 801 live. If you can make it, that's optional. For those of you that's Section 002 or 02, it's required. Okay, so that's this lecture, and I will see you soon.